Okay, so this week we are going to turn our attention to the 1960s, or we're going to begin to turn our attention to the 1960s. And I say begin because this is a decade, and you can see it from the title there on these lecture slides. It says the stormy 60s, and we don't even really get all the way through the decade because we sort of cut this off at 1968. We'll talk a little bit about why that is at the end of our time together today. This is one of the most jam-packed decades of turmoil, of progress, of regression in some cases. There is just a whole bunch of stuff that's going on in the 1960s. And you can see kind of a rundown there on that title slide. We begin with JFK, and by the time we get to the 1968 presidential election, Kennedy has almost become an afterthought. There's so much stuff that happens between his election in 1960 and the 1968 election. There's just so much that happens in 8 years. Really, because there's several different issues that sort of come to the forefront that sort of become like a powder keg, right? And there's a couple of things that happen that sort of set that powder keg off. And so what we're going to do here over the next 3 weeks is we're going to try to break those issues down the best that we can. Now, there's sort of three larger issues that are at play here in the 60s. There's sort of the politics, and that's the typical stuff that we need to go over. Presidents, their policies, their interaction with Congress, things like that. And that's what we're going to talk about today is sort of the political side of the coin. But then we have the civil rights movement and then Vietnam, the Vietnam War. And sort of as a byproduct of those two things, we also have the protest movements of the mid to latter 1960s. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. We are not going to get to all of it, nowhere even remotely close. So just for this week, we're going to focus on the politics of the presidencies of John F. Kennedy and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Wednesday, then, for our class time together, we will talk about JFK's assassination, which is not necessarily a political event, but it is obviously very, very important. It's also shrouded in a lot of controversy, which makes it one of the more interesting things to talk about. So that's what we'll talk about on Wednesday. Next week, then we'll move into the civil rights movement. And then finally in week 5, we will talk about Vietnam. There will be a lecture on Vietnam. And then on that Wednesday, we will talk about sort of the student protest movement. So there's a lot of stuff that we got to get through here in these next 3 weeks. But here, let's go ahead and talk about John F. Kennedy. Now, there's a lot of stuff here on these slides. We're not going to go through all of it in great detail, but we see, again, that idea of sort of naming a bundle of policies, presidents naming their policies. And with Kennedy, it's the new frontier, okay? And the word with Kennedy's presidency, short-lived as it is, and actually, I guess it does last 3 years, optimism. That's the word that you want to think about when you think about the Kennedys is optimism. And you can see the picture there. JFK and his brother Robert, or Bobby, as he was more commonly known as, and then their cousin, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, who just passed away here within the last 5 to 10 years. The Kennedys are young. They're considered by many to be good looking. They're energetic. They're highly intelligent. As you can see there, they're Ivy League educated, and there's a lot of optimism that sort of their youthful exuberance is going to sort of inject a little bit of energy into the American political spectrum. And in a lot of ways, they're right. Kennedy's going to launch a number of different programs that we're going to talk about here in just a second that do spark a lot of optimism. One thing, though, to point out is that with all this young, energetic um, sort of exuberance, um, the Kennedys come off as being a little snobbish, maybe. You can see, again, the reference to Harvard here. His cabinet is known as the Brain Trust, right? Because these are these, young, highly educated intellectuals. So, on the coasts, certainly the Kennedys are very, very popular. In sort of the middle of the country, sort of politically, where you see a little bit more of a conservative bent, especially in the South. The Kennedys are not incredibly popular because they sort of have this snobbish, uppity sort of sense about them. Now, what's important to keep in mind, too, as we move forward, I know we talked, I believe it was last week or maybe the week before last, about presidents seizing an opportunity when their political party controls Congress. And we would think that with the Kennedy presidency that would happen because Kennedy is a Democrat and there's a Democratic majority in Congress when he's elected in 1960. And so once again, you would think pedal to the metal, this young, energetic guy is going to get all these things accomplished that he wants to get accomplished. But in fact, he doesn't, because that Democratic majority is a little bit deceiving in the sense that a great number, I shouldn't say a great number, but a lot of those Democrats were from the South, where that term Democrat is a little bit different. It's a little bit more of a conservative Democrat. So they sort of act more like Republicans, which is kind of interesting. But this is what we're left with to begin the 1960s is Kennedy and his new frontier. And this political cartoon is always it has always kind of been one of my favorites because, well, for a number of reasons. But one, and I think I can kind of, if I can select this, I can make it a little bit bigger and we can look at it a little bit closer. You've got, and of course, let's see, order. My computer does not like that I'm trying to do multiple things at once. But that's okay. What I love about this cartoon is it's sort of the passing of the baton. If I can ever get this to pop up. There we go. It's sort of a passing of the baton. So here on the left, the figure with the glasses, you can see there two-term Harry. And that is, of course, Harry S. Truman, who is Democratic president in the early 40s and on into the beginning of the 50s. Took over after FDR, sort of the old-style Democrat, right? And you can see there he's an older-looking gentleman. And then you can see the bottle there. It says the "Give 'Em Hell" campaign, and Harry S. Truman was known as "Give 'Em Hell Harry," just for sort of the frank way that he spoke and his sort of no-nonsense approach to political life. And then you have Jack the Kid, right? And this is this is John F. Kennedy, who's depicted as this very young, very clean cut, a fresh face. You can see just sort of his shock and amazement at the shot that two-term Harry has given him, and then in the background, looking on, you have the donkey, which is of course the symbol of the Democratic Party. And this is such a great cartoon because it illustrates that sort of passing of the baton from one part of the Democratic Party to another, sort of the older, more experienced maybe side of the Democratic Party to now this younger, sort of more vibrant, vibrant part of the party. Really, in a lot of ways, there's some similar things maybe happening today in 2020 with the Democratic Party. You can see up there at the top, just leave the bottle there, bartender. So we have sort of this new energy, right, in the form of John F. Kennedy. Now, the new frontier, we have to start, first of all, with the Cold War, and we're going to spend a fair bit of time here talking about the Cold War because there's a lot of optimism with how Kennedy is going to handle the Cold War. And at this point, we've sort of gone through this and have been dealing with the Cold War now for going on, a couple of decades or pretty close to it, about 15 years. And something that we didn't get a chance to talk about the last couple of weeks is sort of the Truman and the Eisenhower approach to the Cold War, and specifically to fears of aggression from the Soviet Union. We mentioned MAD, which is mutually assured destruction, that policy that said, you know what, if the Soviet Union were to attack us, we're going to attack back in full force. We're going to absolutely destroy them, even if it means, them absolutely destroying us. Nobody's going to be left alive. And it was sort of this locked in place policy where if A happens, B then happens. And if C happens, then D happens. What Kennedy encourages is this thing called flexible response, where he says, we're going to take each Soviet action sort of on its face. We're going to take each situation as it arises, and we're going to handle it accordingly. And this is known as flexible response, right? Not only that, the Truman and the Eisenhower approach to the Soviet Union in general was, while on the one hand, yes, we have this policy of mutually assured destruction or massive retaliation, meaning that if the Soviet Union fires a starter pistol at us, we're going to launch a nuke at them. While they have that on the one hand, Truman and Eisenhower, on the other hand, want to completely ignore the Soviet Union and act like they're not even there. Okay, Kennedy sort of bucks this trend a little bit, and he says, we need to accept that the Soviet Union is going to have some influence. And instead of just trying to completely ignore them, then we need to reach out to those countries that are not yet sort of under the Soviet yoke. Okay, and so he creates programs like the Peace Corps, which you see the symbol of there in the middle of the PowerPoint, where we're going to send out people from the United States to these places that are called third world countries, which are basically just countries that have not yet chosen a path. They haven't chosen communism. They haven't chosen capitalism. We're going to send volunteers out to sort of bolster the image of the United States, and they're going to volunteer. They're going to volunteer to build schools, to provide medical care, to help a country develop their natural resources and their industrial resources. Right. JFK also says, there's more ways to sort of compete with the Soviet Union than just an arms race. The Soviet Union is the first country to put a man into space. And so Kennedy sort of takes that as a challenge and says, all right, well, we're going to be the first nation to put a man on the moon. And Kennedy actually sets a goal that we are going to have a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And that's a goal that ultimately comes to fruition. Now, Kennedy has long since passed, but it's one of those. It's just another sort of avenue for competition with the Soviet Union. Now, you're going to see here on this next slide, there are some drawbacks to flexible response. And one of the big drawbacks is that it's difficult to gauge each instance of aggression and what the appropriate level of response is. So the first one here is that we need to talk about. The first thing we need to talk about is the Bay of Pigs. And this becomes important to set up what is sort of the defining moment of Kennedy's presidency with regard to his foreign policy of this flexible response. The CIA had attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro, who is a communist leader of Cuba, multiple times. And at the end of the Eisenhower administration, they hatched a plan that was called Bay of Pigs. Okay, and Bay of Pigs is named for we get that name for an actual bay in Cuba that is called Bahia de Cochinos, which is Bay of Pigs. And the invasion essentially went like this. The CIA had found a number of Cuban defectors, people who had fled Cuba for political reasons, for political persecution reasons, found these exiles. The CIA then would train them, would provide the military training, funding, and then send those exiles back to Cuba, armed with their knowledge of the island and its infrastructure and its geography and things like that. And these exiles would then carry out a coup. In other words, they would overthrow Castro and take over the Cuban government, and then obviously ally with the United States. Now, this is all hatched under the Eisenhower administration. So when Kennedy gets elected in 1960, this plan is almost complete. And so the CIA brings it to Kennedy and says essentially, look, here's the plan. This has been in the works for years. We've ironed this out. This is a golden opportunity to get rid of Castro. You need to do it. Just sign on the dotted line. You're the president. We need your approval. Just sign on the dotted line. We'll do it. And Kennedy relents. Kennedy says, okay. And so he signs off on the invasion, and it is an absolute disaster. The exiles are not nearly well trained enough. They don't have the proper strength in terms of numbers to carry out a coup. It's a massive failure. It's a huge embarrassment to JFK, and it sort of emboldens communism around the world, both there in Cuba, but then also the Soviet Union. At the same time, right around the same time, 1961, and you can see that as a note down there at the bottom, the Russians build the Berlin Wall in 1961. So you have these two things, the Bay of Pigs and then the Berlin Wall that both happened in 1961 that are seen very early on as massive failures in the Kennedy presidency. And the Berlin Wall obviously is going to divide East and West Berlin, right? Now, what does this have to do with sort of the defining moment of Kennedy's foreign policy? Well, later on in October of 1962, the Soviet Union, we have evidence from some U-2 spy planes who take frequent passes. These U-2 spy planes are these high-altitude planes that have these highly advanced cameras. And they take pictures. They're flying over Cuba constantly, taking pictures to make sure that there's no sort of, hostile activity in the area. And sure enough, in October of 1962, these U-2 spy planes, they photograph a couple to, I want to say 3 to 4 different missile sites where the Soviet Union has come into Cuba, and they are setting up ballistics missiles sites where, according to the images and then according to intelligence that we have, that now, and I think this is on, yep. According to the intelligence that we have, you can see that there's actually 5 missile sites. The Soviet Union can now hit a number of different cities in the United States. Now, this is important because obviously, to this point, we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about a direct offensive from the Soviet Union. In other words, to this point, if the Soviets are going to launch a direct attack on the United States of America, we're going to have some time. We're going to have some notice, right? Well, now with missiles literally in our backyard, places like Miami, New Orleans, Houston, even as far north as Washington, D.C., the nation's capital would be sort of on the periphery of the range of these missiles. you're going to have basically no warning at all. There's going to be little to no warning as to whether or not a nuclear missile, a missile that is armed potentially with a nuclear warhead, is going to hit one of these cities. Very little to no idea, right? So this is obviously a huge, huge problem. Now, again, this is one of those instances where flexible response has both its positives and its negatives. On the positive side, obviously this doesn't trigger World War III, right? Had this happened under the Eisenhower administration, we would have been taking offensive action immediately. And indeed, there were several members of Kennedy's advisors that wanted immediate, decisive action, right? Including his brother Bobby. And I'm always sort of, putting movies out there for those of you that are interested in this stuff. But there is a great movie called 13 Days that is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the movie is very, very good, but it is inaccurate in the sense that the movie portrays Bobby Kennedy as sort of this, hold on, we need to wait, we need to gather more information before we make any kind of action. When in fact, in reality, Bobby Kennedy was still completely and totally steamed about the Bay of Pigs invasion. And he wanted to get rid of Castro immediately. And so he wanted to use this as a pretext to invade Cuba, right? Now, on the negative side, okay, so we don't automatically launch an attack on the Soviet Union or on Cuba, but what now is the appropriate response? That becomes sort of the negative side of this, is how do you gauge what is and what is not appropriate in this case? Now, it says there communication between Washington and the Kremlin. The Kremlin is just it's not the capital of the Soviet Union. It's the name for sort of their capital building, right? Excuse me. Communications are very, very poor. You got to keep in mind it is still the 1960s. But for 2 weeks, there is this possibility of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's a great video on YouTube. You can find it. I might try to link it at some point that asks the question: what if the Cold War ever went hot? And I believe they use the Cuban Missile Crisis as that moment where the two sides actually started firing nuclear weapons at one another. And that group has some not so positive outlook on how that would go. Now, what eventually happens is the two sides reach an agreement after a quarantine where we basically set up a perimeter around the island, a naval perimeter around the island, and say nobody's allowed in or out, and that sort of cuts off the Soviets from the island for the time being. And then at that point, the two sides are able to negotiate somewhat of an understanding where basically the Soviets would come in, disarm, and pull their missiles out of Cuba in exchange for us to not overthrow Castro, not make any more attempts on the communist power in Cuba, and then also secretly remove nuclear weapons from Greece and Turkey. Okay, and that's sort of the defining moment of Kennedy's presidency. And you can see just some pictures there. Or again, some political cartoons, plus just a picture down there at the bottom of Kennedy, who was an avid sports fan. And believe you me, I am cutting quite a bit out of the Kennedy presidency. We're going to come back and talk about Kennedy more, especially when we do the civil rights movement in Vietnam. Excuse me. But what I want to do is skip ahead now to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is Kennedy's vice president. And he takes over for Kennedy after JFK's assassination. And in your 3-2-1 this week, this is the one thing. I know last week I didn't give you anything specific to write on. This week I am, and I'll make a note of that in your 3-2-1 assignment. In your 3-2-1, I want you to write about this picture, okay? Now, this picture, I'll see if I can blow it up kind of like I did the other one. And this one actually works out better because I don't have it set behind the text. This is a picture of LBJ's inauguration. So many of you are going to already know coming into this class that John F. Kennedy is famously or infamously assassinated in Dallas in late 1963. Again, we're going to talk about that on Wednesday, maybe some of the conspiracy theories surrounding that. But when that happens, first of all, we'll back up and we'll talk more about this on Wednesday very quickly. Why is he in Dallas? Well, because again, Kennedy was not very popular in the South. It's part of the reason why he chose LBJ as his running mate is because Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Texas, right? So he's in Johnson's home state, and he's campaigning. He's getting ready to set up, getting ready to launch his reelection campaign in 1964 when he is assassinated. Now, Johnson is with him on the trip. I believe he's in the motorcade, but he is maybe a car or two behind President Kennedy when President Kennedy is shot. And once the president is declared dead, he obviously, per our secession rules, he takes over as the president. Now, what I want you to consider is this picture is taken on Air Force One. And the woman here as you're looking at Johnson, to the right of President Johnson, that is Jackie Kennedy. That is JFK's wife. And so what I want you to think about, this is taken in Air Force One on the tarmac. In other words, they have not taken off from Dallas yet. They're still in Dallas. The plane, you can see just from the picture, is packed. There's people, and we'll talk more about that on Wednesday too. There's people everywhere. Why would it be so important to LBJ to have his inauguration in Dallas before they leave? And why would it be so important that he have Jackie, President Kennedy's wife? Why would that be so important to him? And I'm sure some of you will come up with some perfectly benign reasons. Some of you will come up with far more conspiratorial reasons. But I just kind of want you to think about that and again, just pick one of the things that you learned or one of the things that you thought was interesting. Why now? Why there and why then? And why with Jackie? Those sorts of things. And again, we'll talk more about that on Wednesday in our class session together. But that is the one thing I want to make sure that you write about in your 3-2-1 this week. Now, in terms of Johnson and his time in office, again, he becomes the president in 1963. He finishes out the rest of JFK's term, and then gets reelected in 1964. Relatively easily over a very conservative conservative Republican senator by the name of Barry Goldwater. And you can see the map there. It is an electoral landslide. And Johnson's time in office it says there his second term. It's Johnson's first term in office on his own will and accord. Is marked by two things. One is Vietnam, and that's the second thing that's listed. Which we're not going to talk about today because we're going to talk about Vietnam on its own here in a couple of weeks. But the other thing is this thing called the Great Society, which is probably, yes, he was a dog person. Several presidents have had pets, obviously. That's a tradition going back also to Teddy Roosevelt. You've heard me talk about him quite a bit, actually, these last couple of weeks. I think this is where we're going to leave off today. This is where we're going to leave off. We're actually going to stop right here on this slide because this is one of those things that is sort of a longer lasting legacy that we still have with us today out of the 1960s. You have Kennedy's New Frontier, and now you have Johnson's, what he calls the Great Society. And what he does is he promotes all of these different social projects. And you can see the pictures down here at the bottom. A couple of these things, a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with, especially over here on the right. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Sesame Street. Those are programs that would have been on PBS. PBS is created out of the Great Society. Medicaid, right? Head Start, which is to try to give younger children an earlier start in education, right? We also get the founding of the Department of Transportation, right? There's sort of been a hodgepodge of these different transportation organizations. They're now condensed and coalesced under one organization called the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, okay? The National Endowment for the Humanities, for the Arts, right? NPR, National Public Radio. And you can see that here, and you can see it listed here, but you can also just sort of intuitively know from having an idea of what those different organizations do. FDR is trying to tackle, or FDR, LBJ is trying to tackle four main areas: education, medical care, immigration, which is not as obvious in that list, but then also voting rights. Okay. And not just voting rights, but sort of, again, back to that education piece, making sure that people are educated, making sure that they're well informed, right? And then I guess the last slide that we'll finish on is the Earl Warren Supreme Court. And the reason that I don't want to get too deep into this is because this is a lot more government type stuff, but it's also has a lot of carryover into the civil rights movement, which we're going to talk about next week. But a couple things just to put out there would be Miranda v. Arizona, and that's the fourth one listed there. That's where the police now must read legal rights to the accused before interrogation. And then the other one that I would point out that's on this slide is Engel versus Vitale, which comes actually during the Kennedy administration. That is banning required school prayer in public schools. So just a couple of Supreme Court rulings of note that I wanted to again, just sort of make a note on. So that is sort of our quick survey of the politics of the early 1960s. Now, again, a lot of this is going to be, we're going to get into the really heavy stuff next week when we start talking about the civil rights movement. And then the big one that sort of throws all of this over the edge is going to be Vietnam. That's going to be in 2 weeks. But this is just sort of a good primer and a good setup. So, again, make sure you get your 3-2-1 filled out. And then on Wednesday, like I said, we will be talking about the Kennedy assassination. So until then, have a good day.